Wells Restaurant, Harlem, 2 a.m., July 7th, 1968. Frank Lucas sitting across from Bumpy Johnson, same booth they always sat in. Chicken legs, hominy grits, black coffee. Bumpy was 62 years old, spent half his life locked up, the other half running Harlem. Survived gang wars, mafia beef, federal indictments, decades of street violence. But tonight, something was different. His breathing, heavy, labored, like every breath cost him something. "You listening, Frank?" Frank snapped back to attention. Bumpy had been talking about territory, about respect, about how things changed since he got out of Alcatraz in '63. Always listening. Bumpy smiled. That smile that held decades of seeing young dudes thinking they're paying attention when they really just waiting for their turn to speak. "That's your problem," Bumpy said, reaching for his coffee. "You listen, but you're always thinking about what comes next instead of what is." The cup was halfway to his lips when it happened. If you're hooked by this moment, hit that subscribe button now. What Frank decided in the next 60 seconds reshaped the entire landscape of Harlem, and you need to see how one choice created ripples that lasted decades. Bumpy's hand stopped moving. The coffee cup trembled. Then his whole body went rigid. His eyes widened, not with fear, but with recognition, like a man who'd been expecting a visitor and just heard their knock. "Frank," voice came out tight, compressed. "It's happening." The coffee cup fell. Brown liquid spread across white tablecloth like ink on paper. Bumpy's hand went to his chest, fingers clutching at his shirt jacket, searching for something to hold on to that wasn't there. Then he pitched forward. Frank moved on instinct, out of his seat around the table before Bumpy's head could hit the surface, caught him, eased him down, cradled him like you'd hold something valuable that was breaking. The restaurant froze. Every customer, every waitress, every cook who could see through the service window, all of them stopped moving. Frank's mind racing through calculations at impossible speed. Medical emergency in Harlem at 2 a.m. Options limited, time critical. Call an ambulance, authorities respond, questions follow, investigations begin. Bumpy was under federal indictment. The moment law enforcement arrived, everything became evidence. Everything became risk. Drive him to the hospital directly, faster, fewer questions, less official scrutiny. But moving him could make things worse. And if he didn't make it, Frank would have to explain why he didn't call for proper help. The entire decision tree mapped itself in Frank's consciousness in approximately 3 seconds. Bumpy's eyes flickered open, found Frank's face. Small movement in the corner of his mouth. Might have been a smile, might have been something else. According to Frank Lucas, and this detail would later be disputed, the older man spoke his last words in that moment. "Take care of Harlem," Bumpy whispered. "Your way, not mine." Then his eyes closed. Frank made his decision. "Call an ambulance!" The shout broke the restaurant's paralysis. A waitress ran for the phone. Other customers started moving, offering help, creating chaos that always accompanies crisis. But Frank knew the delay in making the call, those 3 seconds of calculation, had been 3 seconds too many. The ambulance would arrive in minutes. The hospital was 10 minutes beyond that. Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem, would be pronounced dead before they ever made it through the emergency room doors. The ambulance came. The EMTs worked with professional urgency. Frank rode with them to Harlem Hospital, watching paramedics perform procedures that looked more like ritual than rescue. 2:47 a.m. A doctor Frank had never met delivered news Frank had already accepted 20 minutes earlier. The next hours blurred into a sequence of phone calls, arrangements, notifications. Mame Johnson, Bumpy's wife, had to be told. The organization had to be informed. Competitors and allies alike would need to know that Harlem's balance of power had just shifted. But sitting in the hospital waiting room, as dawn started breaking over Harlem, Frank wasn't thinking about power. He was thinking about those 3 seconds. The 3 seconds where he'd calculated instead of acted, where he'd weighed options instead of just calling for help immediately, where he'd let strategic thinking override instinctual response. Had those 3 seconds mattered? Medical professionals would later say Bumpy's heart attack was massive, that even immediate intervention likely wouldn't have changed the outcome. Congestive heart failure at 62, after decades of stress and prison and violence. The ending had probably been written long before that night at Wells' restaurant. But Frank would never know for certain. And in that uncertainty, something crystallized in his mind. A decision that had been forming for years, waiting for the moment it could fully emerge. He wouldn't be Bumpy 2.0. He wouldn't try to replicate what the older man built. The neighborhood godfather model, the community protection approach, the delicate balance between street operations and social responsibility. That was Bumpy's way. Frank Lucas would do it differently. 3 days after Bumpy Johnson's funeral, which drew hundreds of Harlem residents who viewed him as both protector and predator, Frank Lucas boarded a flight to Bangkok, Thailand. He'd been thinking about this trip for years. Bumpy had always shut down the conversation when Frank brought it up. Too risky, Bumpy said, too ambitious. The Italian families controlled the supply chains. You don't break monopolies, you work within them. But Bumpy Johnson was gone. And Frank Lucas had no intention of working within anyone's monopoly. His plan was audacious in its simplicity. Cut out every middleman between the poppy fields of the Golden Triangle and the streets of Harlem. Buy directly from the source, control quality, dictate prices, create a brand that couldn't be competed with. Where Bumpy had ruled through relationships and community ties, Frank would rule through supply chain innovation and business efficiency. Where Bumpy had maintained balance with the mafia families, Frank would make them irrelevant. Where Bumpy had been a neighborhood king, Frank would build an empire. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. Bumpy's alleged last words, "Your way, not mine," had given him permission to dismantle everything Bumpy represented. Whether those words were actually spoken or were construction Frank's memory created to justify what he was about to do, they served their purpose. They freed him. Over the next months, Frank established connections in Southeast Asia that would reshape the drug trade in America. He created Blue Magic, a brand name for purity and consistency. He built a distribution network that operated with military precision. He made himself into something Harlem had never seen before. Not a neighborhood boss, but a corporate CEO, running an illegal enterprise like a Fortune 500 company. The transformation happened faster than anyone anticipated. By 1970, Frank Lucas controlled more territory and more resources than Bumpy Johnson ever had. His operation was making money on a scale that made the old numbers rackets look quaint. But the cost was steep. Where Bumpy had been loved and feared in equal measure, Frank was primarily feared. Where Bumpy had given back to the community, even while exploiting it, Frank extracted everything he could. Where Bumpy had maintained equilibrium, Frank created chaos. The federal prosecutor who eventually brought Frank down would call him one of the most outrageous international operations ever, an innovator who got his own connections outside the US. But that came later. In July 1968, standing in a hospital waiting room, Watching dawn break over Harlem, Frank Lucas was just a man who'd made a split-second decision and who would spend the rest of his life wondering if those 3 seconds had mattered. The story of what happened at Wells' restaurant that night exists in multiple contradictory versions. Frank Lucas would later tell journalists, filmmakers, and biographers that he was present when Bumpy Johnson experienced his final moments, that he held the older man, that he heard those last words about taking care of Harlem, your way, not mine. But Bumpy Johnson's widow, Mame, told a very different story. She insisted Frank wasn't present at her husband's death, that Frank had inflated his importance in Bumpy's life and operation, that the intimate mentorship Frank described was mostly fiction, that Frank had been at most someone who held Bumpy's coat. Historical records confirm only the basic facts. Bumpy Johnson experienced congestive heart failure at Wells' restaurant in Harlem around 2 a.m. on July 7, 1968. He was transported to Harlem Hospital, where he was declared deceased. His childhood friends, Finley Hoskins and Junie Bird, were documented as being present. Frank Lucas's presence and his decision about calling the ambulance remains contested. What's not contested is what happened afterward. Whether motivated by genuine last words or by self-granted permission, Frank Lucas did build an empire. He did revolutionize supply chains. He did become, for a brief period in the early 1970s, one of the most powerful figures in organized operations in America. And he did it by choosing his own way, not Bumpy's. The question of whether those 3 seconds at Wells' restaurant mattered, whether an immediate 911 call would have changed Bumpy's outcome, whether Frank's calculation cost him those final moments, remains unanswerable. But for Frank Lucas, those 3 seconds became the founding myth of his transformation. The moment when hesitation turned into determination, when grief turned into ambition, when the death of a mentor became the birth of an empire. True or embellished, remembered accurately or reconstructed by memory's selective editing, the story served its purpose. It gave Frank Lucas the narrative he needed to become Frank Lucas. And narrative, in the end, shapes reality as much as reality shapes narrative. This account is based primarily on Frank Lucas's own recollections of July 7, 1968, which have been significantly disputed by Bumpy Johnson's family and other historical sources. Multiple aspects of Lucas's relationship with Johnson remain contested, and his presence at Johnson's final moments is not independently verified. If this examination of a disputed but influential moment interested you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped urban America. We've got another incredible story coming soon about a decision made under impossible pressure, where what someone chose not to do mattered more than what they did. Thanks for watching. And remember, the stories we tell about ourselves can be as powerful as the truth.